G'day guys, this is Holy Critics signing in, and I just got back from seeing Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I thought I would share my first impressions and where I felt the whole movie went wrong. Now, this is going to be filled with heaps of spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie yet, I do recommend you watch it. It is a good movie, but just go watch it, come back and then watch this video, because I share where I think it went wrong and how I would have made the movie so much better. I think Tarantino, he's a brilliant director, and as you can see behind me, I love his movies, but I've noticed a trend, at least since his last movie, The Hateful Eight, where he's devoting far too much time to characters and setting, which are important aspects to a good movie, but he devotes way too much time to those two elements and forgets completely about the storytelling. And what really ruined Once Upon a Time in Hollywood for me was that the first act of the movie, which was the character development, the relationship between Leonardo DiCaprio, who plays a character named Rick Dalton, a failing movie actor, and his stunt man slash assistant handyman, Brad Pitt, called Cliff Booth, I think Clifford Booth, something like that. That was a brilliant first period of the movie, the first act, where they had a relationship. They're almost got this brotherly love, this buddy hangout type situation. But Tarantino devotes way too much time, and it drags for about an hour and a half. The first hour and a half of the movie, basically nothing happens. All it is a slice of life of Hollywood. And you see them driving around in these long takes where they're driving on the freeway, and you can see all this wonderful set design, and it's, you know, it looks aesthetically pleasing, but there's no justification for it because there's no story being told. It's just meandering and completely self-indulgent, which Tarantino does have a habit of slick dialogue and, you know, flashy directing, but without the story, it kind of tires on you. And I felt like the first half of the movie, which should have really been no longer than an hour, 45 minutes at most, drags on beyond an hour and a half. And by the time any real action happens, when the connection between the Manson cult gets entangled with Brad Pitt's character, by that point, you kind of lost interest. And on that point, the way in which Quentin Tarantino handles the Charles Manson connection, I felt was a gimmicky inclusion, because it lacked any real historical accuracy, because I'm someone who's done a lot of research on that particular case, the Sharon Tate LaBianca murders, and the real life case is almost stranger than fiction, but Tarantino has this obsession with alternate history, alternate timelines, and it doesn't work for this movie, and I'll tell you why. When Brad Pitt rocks up at the Spahn Ranch, it's a really intense moment, and you start to feel this subtle dread come over you, because you know he's in a very, very precarious position, yet he doesn't fully realize it. And his connection to the place is that he knows George Spahn. He worked with him years earlier as a stunt man on a Western show where they filmed on location. And he keeps insisting on, you know, I want to see George, you know, I don't normally come up this way, you know, might as well check in. And the Manson clan are all grouping up around him, and they're telling him, well, he doesn't like to be woken, you know, he's a very, you know, he won't be very happy. And that's that little exchange between Brad Pitt, who's completely outnumbered, and this almost paranoid schizophrenic clan that are grouping up around him. it makes for a tense moment, and it is absolutely the best scene in the movie, no doubt about it, because you could believe that this really happened. And then after that, it goes back to the first act again. There's just no story there. It's just him going from movie set to movie set, acting out and, interacting with other actors around him. And that's all, it makes for good comedy, but it tires on you and you just want to get to the Manson stuff. And they keep denying you of what you want to see. And then at the end of the movie, it skips forward 6 months in time. Now we're on the night of August 1969, Cielo Drive, Los Angeles. The Klan rock up to the address and they don't even commit the murder. What? You've got these psychopathic freaks, and if you know the history, they go up there and they murder 5 people, but they're intercepted by Rick Dalton. And there's this massive, almost gratuitously violent end to the movie, and it's so abrupt, and it's unwarranted because these people haven't done anything yet. It just feels like a rushed ending. He had to squeeze it in. It's getting near the 3-hour mark, and he just has to find some way to end the movie, and it doesn't work. And it makes you feel like it feels like a phony ending, a phony happy ending. And I walked away with a feeling of huge disappointment. Okay, so now that I've ranted about where I think the movie went wrong, what would I have done to make the movie better? Well, I think the weakest point of the movie was the lack of a strong story arc. Now, I've broken this down into first, second, and third act because that's the 3-act structure that the best stories are told within. In the first act, I think Tarantino did perfectly. He established Leo and Brad as this unbreakable pair with strong chemistry between them, to have a brotherly relationship, and they look out for each other as Rick Dalton's career is slowly fading into insignificance. He's just getting bit parts and he's struggling to survive in the game of Hollywood. And now that method acting has come on the scene, he's been relegated to a bygone era. And they also established Sharon Tate. And Sharon Tate is portrayed as this almost whimsical, party, fun-loving girl, angelic in a way. And if you know the history, you know that what Tarantino's doing here is setting up her demise because she doesn't deserve what she's going to get down the road. That's done perfectly, right? I think he sets up the movie perfectly. He sets the scene well. But where he went wrong is he should have cut it shorter. And by the end of the first act, Rick Dalton's relationship with his assistant Cliff Stuntman should have ended. Because in the movie, Leo goes away to Italy and he starts filming some spaghetti westerns, but they don't really gain him enough money to continue employing Brad Pitt. So by the end of it, he meets up with him in a bar and says, "I can no longer afford to hire your services," and they part ways. I think that should have come at the end of the first act, within the first hour, to create the second plot now, where Brad Pitt connects up with the Manson clan. Now, the second act is where the movie should have gained its traction. And this is the point where Brad Pitt travels to the Spahn Ranch and meets up with the clan and interacts with George Spahn. Now, that scene ended and I was disappointed, but where I would have changed it is based on the end of the first act where Brad Pitt is now unemployed, where he could have connected up to a real-life historical character was that a man by the name of Donald Shea, who was actually a stuntman, was employed in real life by George Spahn, who was becoming increasingly suspicious of Charles Manson's activities and his exploitation of his property. And if you look into this case, you begin to wonder why Tarantino didn't connect the dots here, because Donald Shea the character of Donald Shea would have given a prime opportunity for us to be introduced to Charles Manson, to see his manipulation, his psychopathy, and how he influenced the clan to go out and commit these heinous crimes. And in real life, the second act could have ended with Donald Shea, who in real life was murdered by Charles Manson and was only found 10 years later in 1977. That could have been Brad Pitt's character. It should have been a shock point in the movie where he dies at the end of the second act. And it can be a moment that blindsides you as the audience because you're not expecting the hero to be killed. But this would have ushered in the third act, which would have been the Tate murders in Cielo Drive. And I kept thinking to myself, why didn't Tarantino do the research? Donald Shea was a real person, and he almost parallels Brad Pitt's character in the movie. He dies, and the third act would have been now the clan, who at 6 months in time have now gone forward, they've driven up to Cielo Drive to murder Sharon Tate. And they should have gone through with it. They should have committed the act, the worst imaginable act, because that's what was set up by the first act. Sharon Tate was this lovely person and she dies in such a horrible way. And if you saw that, you'd be so angry that you hoped that justice would be served to these horrible members of the clan like Tex Watson. So how would I have ended the movie? Well, they commit the crime, and as they're walking down the driveway, in real life, this really happened, they washed off with a garden hose to wash all the blood off after they'd written, a scrawled pig on the front door. They wash off the blood, and a homeowner by the name of Rudolph Weber, you can look this up, was woken up at about 1 a.m. by their snickering and the noise that was being made by this clan of three. He goes downstairs, confronts them and says, "What are you doing here? This is a private street," like Leonardo's character does in the movie. And at that point, the ending that Tarantino has in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood should have stood, because they go back to their car and then they ponder in their mind, that is a potential witness. We better kill him too. And that could have been the point where Tarantino had his alternate ending. But he didn't. And I thought, well, these are real life events that he could have connected with, because early on in the movie, they show that Polanski and Sharon Tate live on the same street as Rick Dalton. He doesn't have any interaction with them, but it's established that they live in the same proximity. And that could have been the moment where they meet their justice, because they go back in the house and Leonardo DiCaprio has to fight them off, and there's a big shootout, a big violent, climax to the movie. And they would have had at least a feeling of a bittersweet ending, because Sharon Tate dies and it's sad, but they also get their revenge. So that's how I would have structured the movie, and I feel like that would have been there would have been more catharsis to that. Tell me in the comments, guys, have you seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood yet, and did you love it? Was it one of your favourite Tarantino movies? Because for me, it's way down the list. Probably behind Hateful Eight, because it just didn't work. This is just my opinion. You guys can love it. I hope you did, because I just have this feeling of disappointment, and I just wanted to share it with you guys. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. And this is Holy Critic, signing out.